Thales was not the only pre-Socratic thinker to hail from Miletus. He was followed by two thinkers with wonderful, albeit confusingly similar names, Anaximander and Anaximenes. We know a bit more about them than we do about Thales, but don't get your hopes up too high. Our evidence about them is pretty thin. I have already mentioned how amazing it is that information about these earliest Greek philosophers has reached us at all. Maybe it's worth dwelling on this just a bit longer. Remember, these figures lived in the 6th century BC. To get some idea of how much time has elapsed since the birth of philosophy, take someone else who lived a long time ago. Charlemagne, the conqueror who founded the Holy Roman Empire. He was born in the mid-8th century AD, which is early in the medieval period. But that still puts him slightly closer to us in time than to the birth date of Thales. Even for ancient philosophers like Aristotle, Thales and his immediate successors were far enough in the past that it was hard to know much about them. So we should really marvel that we, more than 2 millennia after Aristotle, know anything about the earliest Greek philosophers at all. Even if Aristotle wasn't necessarily all that well informed about the first pre-Socratics, he is still one of our most important sources of information about them. Another main source is Aristotle's student Theophrastus, who made it his business to collect and interpret bits of information about the history of philosophy up until his time. This is the sort of thing Aristotle and his followers loved to do. They were great collectors of information and threw themselves into it zealously, whether they were dissecting shellfish or trying to piece together the ideas of someone like Anaximander. Unfortunately, there are a couple of pitfalls for us here. In the last chapter, I mentioned that Aristotle often recast pre-Socratic ideas in terms of his own ideas and vocabulary. A good example is the first book of the Physics, in which Aristotle tries to classify a whole range of pre-Socratic thinkers in terms of how many principles of nature they recognized. As you would expect, given that he was Aristotle's student, Theophrastus seems to have followed Aristotle in this respect. A second problem is that Theophrastus's own works, like the writings of the pre-Socratics themselves, are mostly lost. Apart from Aristotle, the most useful surviving reports on the pre-Socratics come from late antiquity. Like Aristotle and Theophrastus, the late ancient reporters were rarely interested in neutral presentation of pre-Socratic theories. Certain very informative works known as doxographies itemize the characteristic doctrines of these long-dead thinkers, drawing in part on Theophrastus. These follow the Aristotelian tendency to force the pre-Socratics into schematic contrasts and systems. One other important sources include late ancient Platonists, especially Simplicius, a commentator on Aristotle who lived in the 6th century AD, and the Church Fathers. Simplicius does have some philosophical axes of his own to grind, but he's unusually interested in accurate reporting of the ancients because he worries that information about them is becoming increasingly difficult to find already in his own day. Predictably, the Christian fathers have a somewhat less positive attitude towards these long-dead pagan thinkers. The upshot is that when we read through a collection of testimonies and fragments from the pre-Socratics, we are nearly always seeing them filtered through multiple layers of interpretation and distortion. The task of reconstructing pre-Socratic thought is beginning to look pretty daunting. Despite all this, as I say, we do know more about Anaximander and Anaximenes than we do about Thales. The tradition claims that Anaximander was actually Thales' student and Anaximenes was then Anaximanders. We don't need to take this too seriously, because ancient authors love to construct chains of teacher-student relationships, whether they existed or not. All you really need to know is that Anaximander was just a bit younger than Thales, and that Anaximenes was the generation after that. So let's tackle Anaximander first. Like Thales, he could claim some expertise in physical science. He's credited with setting up a gnomon, a device like a sundial, in Sparta, back in mainland Greece. Remember that Miletus is on the western coast of what is nowadays Turkey, so it's notable that he would have traveled from there as far as Sparta. Another scientific achievement was his production of a map which showed, we are told, both the earth and the sea. This would have been an appropriate activity for someone from Miletus, which, as we've seen, was a vibrant economic center, with trading connections all over the Mediterranean and up into the Black Sea area. Anaximander is best known for saying that the principle of all things is what he called the infinite. The word in Greek is apeiron, which means, literally, that which has no limit. Several different English words have been used to translate this, not only infinite, but also boundless, unlimited, and indefinite. These different translations bring out different connotations, which really do apply to Anaximander's principle. He did apparently think that the apeiron was infinitely big. In other words, that it stretched out in space indefinitely far and surrounds the cosmos in which we live. And we also know that he thought it was eternal, so infinite in time as well as space. On the other hand, Theophrastus thought it was important to contrast Anaximander to Thales by saying that whereas Thales' principle was water, Anaximander's principle was nothing in particular. It was, in other words, indefinite, having no one nature. Rather, Anaximander said, things with definite nature like air or fire were, as he put it, separated out from the apeiron. This takes us to a rather exciting moment, which is the opportunity to quote the first substantial surviving fragment from pre-Socratic philosophy. It was reported by Theophrastus and then preserved by Simplicius, the aforementioned commentator on Aristotle. Here it is. Things come to be and are destroyed, Anaximander said, according to necessity, for they mete out penalty and retribution to one another for injustice according to the ordering of time. After citing this, Simplicius adds that Anaximander was expressing himself rather poetically, even though he was writing in prose and not verse. The fragment isn't a lot to work with, and in fact, it's not even certain how it is supposed to relate to the principle called the infinite or indefinite. But taking up the idea of separating off, what interpreters tend to think is that the different substances separated out of the apeiron generate and destroy each other, and that over the long haul this process balances out, so as to restore what Anaximander calls justice. The idea about the ordering of time might suggest that this all happens according to some kind of cycle, which is a popular idea in early Greek thought, and found also in Hesiod. We can make this a bit more concrete by looking at further evidence about Anaximander, which again comes ultimately from Theophrastus. This evidence bears on the way Anaximander thought the world around us was formed, and in particular, how the sky and heavenly bodies come about. He said that through a process which is unfortunately rather obscure, a ball of fire came to exist around the air surrounding the earth. This ball of fire surrounded the air, Anaximander said, like bark surrounding a tree. The flame then burst apart into rings or circles, which were again enveloped in some kind of air or mist. Round holes in the mist allow us to see the circles of fire, but only partially. And these circular glimpses of the fire are the heavenly bodies. The moon waxes and wanes because the holes in the mist are closing and opening. Now this is clearly pretty cool, but how does it relate to the business about the infinite and things being separated, paying retribution to one another, and all that? Well, the report I've just been describing starts by saying that in Anaximander's scheme, something separates hot and cold out from the eternal. The eternal is presumably his first principle, the operon. The cold part is probably the air or mist, and the hot part is obviously going to be the fire. Notice how they then interact with one another, the mist first being hugged tight by the fire, like the bark on a tree, and then shrouding the rings of flame out in the heavens. All of this suggests that Anaximander was fascinated by the opposed forces we see in nature around us. These countervailing forces, which are things like mist and flame, with opposing characteristics, are what pay retribution to one another. The infinite is indefinite. It has no characteristics that could be opposed to one another, but it is somehow the source of what does enter into opposition, and because it is infinite in the sense of being inexhaustible, the process of mutual opposition will never cease. This theme of constant and dynamic opposition, which takes place against the background of an underlying unity, is one of the most enduring features of pre-Socratic philosophy. We'll find it most strikingly in Heraclitus, but the same idea will appear too in Empedocles and Anaxagoras. Even Aristotle will try to explain nature in terms of opposition and unities. Also, typically pre-Socratic is the attempt to explain something huge and complicated. In fact, the whole cosmos, by invoking fundamental constituents and forces. The ambitions of the theory may go further still. Some evidence suggests that Anaximander had in mind more than just our cosmos. Theophrastus tells us that in Anaximander's theory, it wasn't just stuffs like air and fire that are separated out from the infinite, but also whole worlds. If this is not entirely misleading, and some think it is, then this could mean either an infinite number of worlds, like our own, scattered out through the infinity, or it could mean an unending series of cycles for our own cosmos. Both ideas would again have resonances in later pre-Socratic thought. The notion that at least our own cosmos does operate in cycles is supported by a bit of testimony which says that Anaximander believed our world is drying out, the seas gradually retreating as the sun heats them and turns the moisture into wind. Maybe the idea is that we live within a part of the cosmic cycle where heat is gradually overwhelming what is cold and moist, a 6th century BC version of global warming. The idea that things were wetter in the distant past would go well with another scrap of information, which preserves what is probably Anaximander's most memorable idea, apart from the infinite principle. He claimed that the first animals were gestated inside moisture and then broke out of it, as if through the bark of a tree. He seems to have had a thing about bark one can't help noticing. He also suggested that man couldn't originally have been the way he is now, since the first generation of children would not have survived, far too helpless. Rather, they were formed inside of fish, and full-grown adults burst out of them. This shouldn't be taken as some kind of proto-theory of evolution, because there's no idea here that fish gradually become more and more human over many generations. Rather, it looks more like an attempt to take the idea of Thales, that all things come from water or moisture, and flesh it out. If you'll pardon the pun. If you won't pardon the pun, this book may not be for you. Overall, it looks like Anaximander had a more abstract approach, one is tempted to say more philosophical approach, than Thales did. His infinite is a conceptual leap and seems to be derived from pure argument rather than empirical observation. Some have seen another impressively philosophical approach in his explanation of why the Earth stays where it does. He thought the Earth is a squat cylinder shaped like a drum, and we live on the flat upper surface. Aristotle tells us that Anaximander then wondered why this cylindrical Earth doesn't move around. The reason, he decided, is that the Earth is right in the middle of the cosmos, so no direction would be a more appropriate way for it to move than any other. This is interesting because it shows Anaximander demanding that there be a good reason for the Earth to move in a particular direction, if it is going to move. The mere equivalence of all the directions it could move is enough to keep it in place. We might have expected things to develop further in this way, getting more abstract and conceptual. Indeed, they will when we get to Heraclitus. However, the very next thinker on our itinerary is Anaximenes, who seems to go in the other direction. He agreed with Anaximander that the principle of everything is infinite, but he was happy to go ahead and identify it with a particular substance, not water this time, but air. It would, however, be wrong to think that Anaximenes was just ignoring his similarly named predecessor and retrenching to a view like that of Thales. His philosophy actually builds on Anaximander's in at least one important way, by explaining how the different stuffs that make up the cosmos are generated out of one another. If you start with air, Anaximenes said, you can change it by making it thicker or thinner. When it gets thinner, more diffuse, it gets hotter and becomes fire. But when it gets thicker, it gets colder and becomes wind, then cloud, then water, and finally earth and rocks. Why does he start with air and not fire, the thinnest stuff, or for that matter, rocks, the densest stuff? 3 reasons, I'd guess. First, the sources suggest that Anaximenes was impressed by the fluidity of air. So perhaps he selected air as his principle because he wanted to emphasize the dynamism of the natural world, like Anaximander with his constantly opposed forces. Second, a related point, just like Anaximander's apeiron, Anaximenes' air is that from which other things are separated out. The nice thing about air, at least on his theory, is that you can either thin it out and make fire, or thicken it and make cold things like water and earth. It is an in-between kind of stuff, and so can be the principle for both hot and cold things. Third, there's the fact that air is invisible, unlike fire, clouds, seas, and rocks. So if there is some infinite, unbounded substance surrounding us in all directions, it must be air, otherwise we would be able to see it. Like Thales and Anaximander, Anaximenes wanted to explain the whole cosmos in terms of these basic constituents. He said that the Earth we live on is shaped not like a drum, but like a disc. It forms by the aforementioned process of thickening air, and then rides on the air that is still in its original state. The obvious comparison is to a frisbee, although I haven't seen any secondary literature about pre-Socratic philosophy that is frivolous enough to draw this particular analogy. His Earth, then, is held up by the air, the way Thales' Earth floats in water like a piece of wood. That similarity is not likely to be a coincidence. Certainly here Anaximenes was closer to Thales than to Anaximander, since he agreed with the earlier thinker both about the disc-like shape of the earth and the need for it to be borne up by something. He furthermore said that the stars, planets, sun, and moon are made of fire. In a lovely image, Anaximenes apparently compared them to fiery leaves, which are floating up in the airy, boundless heaven. In a more amusing comparison, he said the heavens rotate around the disk of the earth like a felt hat being spun around on somebody's head. Anaximenes also had something to say about the soul. Unsurprisingly, he said that the soul is made of his favorite stuff, air, which in this case is breath. This idea of the soul as breath, or in Greek pneuma, that's where we get the word pneumatic, is going to have a long career in later ancient philosophy. It makes a certain amount of sense, given that if an animal stops breathing, it stops living. This also allows Anaximenes to make a comparison between the human body and the body of the cosmos. Both are sustained by the most fundamental substance, namely air. Again, this is an idea with a long afterlife. Right down through the medieval period, it will be popular to say that the human is a little version of the physical cosmos, literally a microcosm. Though some doubt that Anaximenes was making this point, I find it plausible to believe that he already had something like the idea of man as a microcosm. Before too long, Heraclitus will set out a very similar theory, according to which both the soul of man and the principle of the universe are made of the same stuff, in his case, fire. Remember that Thales too said that magnets have a soul, possibly because he wanted to argue that the whole physical cosmos is permeated by soul, just like we are. So during the early generations of pre-Socratic philosophy, this parallel between man and the cosmos seems to have been, if you'll pardon another pun, in the air. Both Anaximander's infinite and Anaximenes' air are characterized as divine. Anaximander also says that the infinite, as he puts it, steers everything. It's not quite clear how it could do so. Perhaps by enforcing the reciprocal justice between the things separated out of it. In any case, it is important to realize that these early Greek thinkers were not giving up entirely on the notion of the divine. Anaximenes, in fact, is reported to have said that there are gods, just as Greek religion taught, but that these gods too came from air. What we see here is a subtle but nonetheless pivotally important feature of pre-Socratic philosophy. These are thinkers who want to hold on to a sense of religious awe in the face of the dynamically changing cosmos they describe. They are not discarding religion, but rather throwing down a challenge to previous conceptions of the divine. The way they do this is fairly nuanced. But things are about to get a lot less subtle with the next philosopher we'll discuss, Xenophanes. He staged a direct attack on the conception of the gods that we find in Homer and Hesiod. In doing so, he inaugurated a not always friendly rivalry between Greek religion and Greek philosophy that will persist right through Plato and Aristotle.